The afternoon sun streamed through the large windows of Atlanta International Airport as Pastor James Wilson made his way to Gate B-23. People rushed in all directions, some running to catch flights, others dragging sleepy children behind them. James checked his boarding pass one more time, Flight 2187 to Chicago, departing at 3:45 p.m. James was a well-known figure in his Atlanta community. At 52, his kind eyes and warming smile had welcomed countless people into his church over the past 15 years. Today, he wore a simple navy blue suit with a light blue shirt, and around his neck hung a small gold cross. Nothing flashy, just a humble reminder of his faith that he'd worn every day since his mother gave it to him 20 years ago. "I hope I didn't forget my speech notes," he mumbled to himself, patting his carry-on bag. The youth conference in Chicago had been marked on his calendar for months. Over 300 young people would be there, looking for guidance and inspiration. When his boarding route was called, James joined the line of passengers shuffling toward the jet bridge. He noticed a young mother struggling with a toddler and a mountain of bags, so he offered to help carry her diaper bag. The woman's relief was immediate. "Thank you so much," she said with grateful eyes. "I'm traveling alone with him for the first time." "No trouble at all," James replied with a warm smile. "My daughter was the same age once. I remember those days." On board the plane, James found his seat, 14C, an aisle seat. He preferred the aisle, especially on longer flights when his tall frame needed to stretch occasionally. He placed his small carry-on in the overhead bin and settled in, pulling out a worn paperback book about community leadership. Across the aisle, an elderly woman with silver hair carefully arranged her belongings. She noticed James and gave him a friendly nod. Behind him, two businessmen discussed quarterly reports in hushed tones. The plane gradually filled with the usual mix of travelers: families heading on vacation, people in suits tapping away on laptops, college students with headphones already in place. Flight attendant Rebecca Taylor moved efficiently through the cabin, helping passengers stow luggage and checking that seatbelts were fastened. At 29, she had been flying with the airline for just over 3 years. Today had already been challenging: a delayed morning flight, a rude passenger who demanded special treatment, and now this fully booked flight to Chicago. As Rebecca checked the overhead bins near row 14, her eyes landed on James's cross. Something about it made her pause for just a moment. She'd been raised in a strictly secular household and had certain views about religious symbols displayed in public. The airline's recent internal memo about passenger comfort floated through her mind, though she couldn't remember any specific policy about religious jewelry. "Sir, is your seatbelt fastened?" she asked James, her voice professional but slightly cooler than it had been with other passengers. "Yes, all set," James replied with a smile, not noticing the slight change in her demeanor. Rebecca moved on, but her eyes kept drifting back to James's seat as she continued her preparations. The small gold cross seemed to catch the cabin light. By the time the safety demonstration began, Rebecca had made a mental note to speak with him once they were in the air. In her mind, religious symbols should be kept private, not displayed where they might make others uncomfortable. The plane backed away from the gate and taxied toward the runway. James opened his book, but found himself saying a silent prayer instead, for safe travels, for the words to reach the young people at the conference, and for open hearts to receive his message. Little did he know that his faith would be tested much sooner than the conference, and in a way he never expected. The seatbelt sign dinged off 30 minutes after takeoff. Passengers began to stretch and move about the cabin. James pulled out his conference notes, making a few last-minute adjustments to his speech. The elderly woman across the aisle had fallen asleep, her head resting against the window. Rebecca finished serving drinks in first class and made her way back through the main cabin. Her eyes immediately found James's cross again, glinting in the cabin lights. Something about it bothered her more than it should. She'd seen plenty of religious jewelry before, but today it struck her differently. Taking a deep breath, Rebecca stopped beside row 14. "Excuse me, sir," she said, keeping her voice low but firm. "I need to ask you to remove or tuck in your necklace." James looked up, confused. His hand instinctively went to the small gold cross. "I'm sorry." "The religious symbol," Rebecca clarified, gesturing toward his neck. "It's company policy to avoid displaying religious items that might make other passengers uncomfortable." A few heads turned in nearby rows. The businessmen behind James paused their conversation. "I've never heard of such a policy," James said, his voice calm and measured. "I've flown with this airline dozens of times wearing my cross." Rebecca shifted her weight from one foot to another. "Well, it's a newer policy. We're trying to be mindful of all passengers." James nodded thoughtfully. "I understand being respectful of others, but this cross has deep personal meaning to me. My mother gave it to me before she passed away. I've worn it every day for 20 years. "I understand that, sir, but rules are rules," Rebecca insisted, her voice rising slightly. "We need to maintain a neutral environment." The woman across the aisle had awakened. She adjusted her glasses and leaned forward. "Young lady, I've been wearing this Star of David necklace on flights for 40 years, she said, pulling a silver pendant from beneath her blouse. "Nobody has ever asked me to hide it." Rebecca's cheeks flushed. "Ma'am, this isn't about—" "It seems exactly about that," the woman interrupted. "What's the difference?" Other passengers were openly watching now. A man 3 rows up half stood to see what was happening. "Could I see the written policy?" James asked politely, trying to diffuse the growing tension. "I'm genuinely curious about when this was implemented." Rebecca's discomfort was visible. "I don't have it with me, but I've been briefed on it." A young woman sitting by the window in James's row looked up from her phone. "I work in corporate communications for another airline," she said. "I've never heard of any U.S. carrier having such a policy. It would definitely make the news." James remained remarkably composed. "Rebecca," he said, noticing her name tag, "I respect that you're doing your job. But this cross isn't just jewelry to me. It represents my faith, which guides everything I do." "Still," Rebecca insisted, though her confidence was clearly wavering, "I need to ask you to comply." The businessman directly behind James cleared his throat. "I'm not religious myself, but I don't see how his necklace affects anyone's flight experience. It's hardly noticeable." Rebecca felt cornered. What had seemed like a straightforward request was turning into a scene. Passengers were giving her looks ranging from confusion to disapproval. "Is there perhaps a misunderstanding about the policy?" James suggested gently. "I'd be happy to discuss this with your supervisor if needed." "The policy is clear," Rebecca stated, though doubt crept into her voice. She was starting to realize she might have overstepped. Religious symbols should be kept private during flights. "My friend," James said with genuine kindness in his eyes, "I think there might be some confusion here. I've never heard of such a restriction on any American airline." Rebecca's walkie-talkie crackled, saving her from responding. Another flight attendant was calling for assistance in the galley. "I need to go," she said quickly, "but we're not finished with this conversation." She turned and walked briskly toward the front of the plane, feeling the eyes of passengers following her. The buzz of conversation filled the cabin after Rebecca hurried away. Several passengers leaned across the aisle to offer James words of support. "That was totally uncalled for," said the businessman behind him. "I've never heard anything so ridiculous in all my years of flying." The elderly woman with the Star of David necklace unbuckled her seatbelt and carefully moved to the empty middle seat next to James. "I'm Ruth," she introduced herself, extending a hand with age spots and a simple gold wedding band. "That young woman had no right to single you out." "Thank you, Ruth," James replied, shaking her hand warmly. "I'm James Wilson. I appreciate your support, but I don't want to cause a scene." "Sometimes standing your ground isn't causing a scene, it's preventing a wrong," Ruth said with the wisdom of her 82 years. A flight attendant James hadn't seen before, a man in his late 30s with a neat beard and a name tag reading Thomas, approached with the beverage cart. He glanced at James's cross but said nothing as he offered drinks. "Excuse me," said the young woman by the window in James's row. "Is there really a policy against wearing religious symbols on this airline?" Thomas looked confused. "No, not at all. Why do you ask?" Before anyone could explain, Rebecca returned. She'd composed herself in the galley, but looked stiff as she approached James's row again. Thomas raised an eyebrow at her, but continued serving drinks a few rows ahead. "Sir, I've discussed the matter with my colleague, and I still need to ask you to comply with our policy," Rebecca said, though her voice lacked its earlier conviction. James folded his hands in his lap. Rebecca, I mean no disrespect, but I believe there's been a misunderstanding. I'd worn this cross on many flights, including with this airline. It was my mother's final gift to me. His voice remained gentle, but there was a quiet strength in his words. More passengers were paying attention now. A woman across the aisle had removed her earbuds. Two people several rows up had turned around completely in their seats. It's a simple request, Rebecca insisted, though her cheeks had reddened. I don't understand why this is becoming an issue. Because you're not asking anyone else to hide their religious symbols, called out a man from 2 rows back. I can see that gentleman there wearing a turban, and that lady has a hijab. Are you going to ask them to remove those two? Rebecca's eyes widened. That's different. How? Several voices asked almost in unison. James held up his hand. Please, everyone. I appreciate your concern, but let's keep this respectful. He turned to Rebecca. I think we both want the same thing, a peaceful flight where everyone feels respected. My cross isn't hurting anyone, just as Ruth's Star of David isn't, or anyone else's religious expression. The tension in the cabin was palpable. Rebecca looked increasingly uncomfortable, caught between backing down and escalating the situation further. Perhaps, James suggested calmly, you could check the actual policy with your supervisor. I'm happy to wait. Thomas had finished serving his section and approached. Is everything all right here? He asked, looking between Rebecca and the passengers. Rebecca asked this gentleman to remove his cross necklace, Ruth explained. She claims it's company policy. Thomas's brow furrowed. That's not our policy, he said simply. He turned to Rebecca with a questioning look. The memo last month about passenger comfort, Rebecca began, was about not discussing divisive topics like politics and religion with passengers. Thomas finished for her. It said nothing about personal religious items. Rebecca's face fell as she realized her mistake. The cabin had grown quiet, with everyone watching the exchange. I think, James said softly, breaking the awkward silence, we all sometimes misinterpret things. It's part of being human. Rebecca stood frozen, unsure how to proceed. Thomas gave her a look that clearly said they needed to talk privately. I need to speak with you in the galley, Thomas said quietly to Rebecca. Looking at James, he added, I apologize for any confusion, sir. As the 2 flight attendants walked away, the cabin erupted in whispered conversations. James closed his eyes briefly, his fingers touching the small cross at his neck, saying a silent prayer for everyone involved, including Rebecca. As Thomas and Rebecca disappeared into the galley, the young woman sitting by the window in James's row suddenly straightened up. She had been scrolling through her phone with renewed interest during the entire exchange. Wait a minute, she said, her eyes widening. Are you Pastor James Wilson from Hope Community Church in Atlanta? She turned her phone screen toward him, showing a news article with his picture. James nodded with a humble smile. That's me, though I don't usually cause this much commotion on flights. The woman's face lit up. My cousin volunteers at your veterans housing program. She told me all about the work you've been doing. Didn't your church just open that new shelter downtown? We did, James confirmed. 3 weeks ago. We've already helped 35 veterans find stable housing. The businessman behind James leaned forward. I thought you looked familiar. There was a feature about your program in the Atlanta Business Chronicle last month. Your church partnered with several companies to provide job training, right? That's correct, James said. We believe in helping people rebuild their lives completely. Ruth patted his arm. No wonder you handle conflict with such grace, dear. You're used to bringing people together. The news spread quickly through the cabin. A flight attendant from first class, an older woman named Diane, came back to see what was happening and recognized James immediately. Pastor Wilson. I can't believe it's you, she exclaimed. My nephew attended your youth program last summer. It completely turned his life around. Passengers who had been watching the earlier confrontation with curiosity were now looking at James with open admiration. Someone a few rows up mentioned that Hope Community Church had recently been featured on a national news program for their innovative approach to community service. In the galley, Thomas was speaking quietly but firmly to Rebecca. That memo was about us not initiating religious or political discussions with passengers. It had nothing to do with what they choose to wear. Rebecca's face had drained of color. I thought it meant we should maintain a neutral cabin environment, she said weakly, by asking people to hide their religious symbols. Thomas shook his head. Think about it. How would that even work? Would we ask people to remove hijabs or turbans too? Of course not, Rebecca said quickly. Then why the cross? Thomas asked gently. Rebecca had no answer. She stared at the floor, realizing how her actions might have appeared to others. Diane burst into the galley, her eyes wide. Do you two have any idea who that man is? That's Pastor James Wilson. Our airline donated to his veterans program last Christmas. The CEO personally attended the ceremony. Rebecca's mouth fell open. What? He runs one of the largest community outreach programs in Atlanta, Diane continued. His church has housed hundreds of homeless veterans, started job training programs, and runs 3 food banks. The man is practically a local hero. Thomas looked at Rebecca with a mixture of concern and sympathy. I think you need to make this right. Back in the cabin, James had pulled out some brochures about the youth conference he was heading to in Chicago. Several nearby passengers had expressed interest in his work. We're expecting about 300 young people this weekend, he explained to the growing audience. The theme is building bridges, breaking barriers. It's all about teaching young people to move past their differences and find common ground. That's exactly what we need more of these days, said a middle-aged woman across the aisle. James nodded. I believe that most conflicts come from misunderstanding and fear, not hatred. When we take time to listen to each other, we usually find we have more in common than we thought. The irony of his words wasn't lost on anyone who had witnessed the earlier confrontation. A man several rows up raised his hand like he was in church. Pastor, given what just happened, would you mind sharing how you stay so calm when facing discrimination? Before James could answer, Thomas emerged from the galley. Behind him, Rebecca stood with her hands clasped tightly together, her face a mixture of embarrassment and resolution. The cabin quieted as passengers noticed their return. Thomas cleared his throat. Pastor Wilson, Rebecca would like a word with you. Rebecca stood at the edge of row 14, her hands trembling slightly. The cabin had grown quiet. Every eye was on her, waiting to see what would happen next. Thomas gave her an encouraging nod before stepping back to give her space. Pastor Wilson, Rebecca began, her voice barely above a whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again. Pastor Wilson, could I speak with you privately? James nodded kindly. Of course. Rebecca glanced around at all the watching faces. Perhaps in the galley? Whatever you have to say, I'm comfortable hearing it here, James replied gently. These folks have been very supportive. Rebecca took a deep breath. I was wrong, she said, the words coming out in a rush. There is no policy against wearing religious symbols. I misunderstood a memo about staff not initiating religious discussions with passengers. A few passengers exchanged knowing looks, but no one interrupted. I think, Rebecca continued, her voice steadying as she spoke, that I let my personal feelings affect how I did my job today. That was unprofessional and unfair to you. James listened attentively, his expression open and free from judgment. Diane told me about your work with veterans and youth programs, Rebecca added. Our airline has even partnered with your church. I had no idea. Many people do good work without recognition, James said. The uniform you're wearing doesn't tell me about the volunteer work you might do on weekends, just as my cross doesn't tell you the whole story of my faith. Rebecca blinked rapidly, fighting back tears. I don't understand why you're being so nice about this. I singled you out. I embarrassed you in front of everyone. Because holding on to anger doesn't help either of us, James replied. 20 years as a pastor has taught me that most people are doing their best with what they know at the time. Thomas appeared at the edge of their conversation. Rebecca, I think we need to address the other passengers as well. People deserve to know that this wasn't airline policy. Rebecca nodded, squaring her shoulders. She turned to face the cabin. I want to apologize to everyone for the disruption. The request I made to Pastor Wilson was not based on any official airline policy. We respect all passengers' religious expressions and personal items. This was my mistake alone. A murmur ran through the cabin. Some passengers nodded in approval at her public admission. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong, Ruth said from her seat next to James. especially in front of a plane full of strangers. Rebecca gave the elderly woman a grateful look before turning back to James. "I'm truly sorry, Pastor Wilson." "Apology accepted," James said without hesitation, "and please call me James." "There's something else," Rebecca said, lowering her voice so only those in the immediate vicinity could hear. "Thomas asked why I singled out your cross when I wouldn't have asked someone to remove a different religious symbol. It made me realize something uncomfortable about myself." James waited patiently as she gathered her thoughts. "My parents were very against religion," Rebecca explained. "They taught me it was all superstition that caused more harm than good. I grew up thinking religious people were less intelligent, I guess. When I saw your cross, those old biases came up without me even realizing it." "Recognizing our blind spots is the first step to growing beyond them," James said. "None of us is free from bias. The question is whether we're willing to face it when it's pointed out to us." Thomas returned with a bottle of water for Rebecca, who looked emotionally drained but relieved. "We're starting our descent into Chicago soon," he told James. "But I wanted you to know that our chief purser has been informed about what happened, and he's mortified. He's arranging for you to receive a travel voucher as a small token of apology." "That's not necessary," James began. "It is to us," Thomas insisted. "Our airline values inclusion, and we want to make this right." As Rebecca returned to her duties, visibly lighter than before, the businessman behind James leaned forward. "That was impressive, Pastor. Most people would have made a scene, demanded her job, threatened a lawsuit." James smiled. "Fighting fire with fire just leaves everything burned. Sometimes a gentle word can change more hearts than 1,000 angry ones." The seatbelt sign dinged on as the plane began its descent into Chicago. Passengers returned to their seats, still buzzing with conversation about what they had witnessed. James tucked his conference notes back into his carry-on bag and fastened his seatbelt. Ruth patted his hand before returning to her own seat across the aisle. "You've given us all something to think about today," she said with a warm smile. "Those young people at your conference are lucky to have you." Thomas had resumed his duties, moving through the cabin to ensure everything was secure for landing. Rebecca had stayed in the forward section of the plane, visibly shaken by the whole experience. As the plane dipped below the clouds, revealing the sprawling cityscape of Chicago, Rebecca emerged from the galley. She walked slowly down the aisle, stopping at each row to check seatbelts and tray tables. When she reached row 14, she paused longer than necessary. "All set for landing, Pastor, James?" she asked, her voice steadier than before but still carrying the weight of their earlier interaction. "All set," James confirmed with a nod. "And how are you doing?" The question caught Rebecca off guard. She wasn't used to passengers asking about her well-being, especially not ones she had treated poorly. I'm okay," she said. "Still processing, I guess." James nodded understandingly. "That's natural. Growth isn't always comfortable." Rebecca glanced around to make sure other passengers were settled, then lowered herself to eye level with James. "I spoke with my supervisor through the intercom," she said quietly. "I told him everything. He wants to meet with me when we land." "I hope you won't face serious consequences," James said sincerely. "We all make mistakes." "That's just it," Rebecca replied, a hint of wonder in her voice. "He said he appreciated my honesty and that this could be a learning opportunity for our whole crew." She shook her head slightly. "I expected to be written up, maybe even suspended." "Sometimes life surprises us with grace when we least expect it," James said. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, causing Rebecca to grab the seat for balance. Once the aircraft steadied, she remained there, seemingly wanting to say more. "My grandfather was a deeply religious man," she said unexpectedly. "He wore a cross like yours. We were very close when I was little, but then my parents had a falling out with him over religion. They stopped letting me see him." Her eyes grew distant with the memory. "When he died, they didn't even take me to the funeral. I was 12. "I'm sorry to hear that," James said gently. "I think seeing your cross brought up old feelings I didn't know I still had," Rebecca continued. "Not just what my parents taught me about religion being harmful, but also the pain of losing my grandfather because of religious differences." A child cried out several rows ahead, and Rebecca straightened up. "I should finish my checks," she said. "Rebecca," James called softly as she turned to go. Thank you for sharing that with me. Your grandfather would be proud of your honesty today." Her eyes brightened with unexpected tears. "Thank you for saying that." As the plane made its final approach, the Chicago skyline glittering in the late afternoon sun, an announcement came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Wilson. We're beginning our final descent into Chicago O'Hare International Airport. The local time is 5:17 p.m. and the temperature is a pleasant 68 degrees. On behalf of the entire crew, I want to thank you for flying with us today." The landing was smooth, the plane touching down with barely a bump. As passengers gathered their belongings and prepared to deplane, Rebecca appeared at James's row one last time. "I want you to have this," she said, handing him a business card with her personal email written on the back. "If you don't mind, I'd like to learn more about your work with veterans. My brother served 2 tours in Afghanistan, and he's been struggling since he came home." James accepted the card with a warm smile. "I'd be happy to help however I can." He paused, then added, "And Rebecca, if you're free tomorrow evening, maybe you'd like to attend our opening session at the youth conference. The theme is moving beyond first impressions. I think you might have something valuable to share." For the first time that day, Rebecca's smile reached her eyes. "I just might take you up on that." 1 month later, the community center attached to Hope Community Church in Atlanta buzzed with activity. Volunteers moved purposefully through the large open space, setting up tables and unloading boxes of supplies. Today marked the launch of a new veteran support program, expanding on the work the church had been doing for years. James stood near the entrance, clipboard in hand, checking off items on his to-do list. The Chicago Youth Conference had been a great success, but he was glad to be back home, continuing the work that meant so much to him. "Pastor James." A familiar voice called from across the room. James looked up to see Rebecca walking toward him, carrying a box of donated clothes. Her airline uniform was replaced by jeans and a Hope Community Church volunteer t-shirt. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she looked more relaxed than she had on the plane. "Right on time," James said with a warm smile. "How was your flight in?" "Smooth," Rebecca replied, setting down the box. "And much less eventful than our last flight together." Her eyes crinkled with the hint of a smile. It had been exactly 4 weeks since their encounter on Flight 2187. Rebecca had indeed attended the youth conference in Chicago, sitting quietly in the back row during James's opening session. Afterward, she had approached him, asking more questions about his work with veterans. When she mentioned her brother's struggles after returning from Afghanistan, James had invited her to visit Atlanta when she had time off. "Is your brother coming today?" James asked, checking another item off his list. Rebecca nodded. "He's parking the car. He's nervous, but he's here." She glanced around the bustling community center. "I still can't believe all this grew from what happened on that flight." "God works in mysterious ways," James said. "Sometimes the most difficult moments lead to the greatest blessings." Thomas, the flight attendant who had intervened during the confrontation, appeared at the entrance, accompanied by 3 other airline employees. They carried boxes with the airline's logo, filled with donated items for the veterans. "Look who else made it," Rebecca said, waving them over. "The airline's community outreach team was thrilled when I pitched this partnership," Thomas explained as he set down his box. "After I told them what happened on the flight and how you handled it, Pastor James, they wanted to expand our existing relationship with your programs." Ruth, the elderly woman who had defended James on the plane, sat at a nearby table, organizing pamphlets about veteran services. At 82, she had become one of the program's most dedicated volunteers, coming in 3 days a week since returning from Chicago. Her grandson, a veteran himself, now served as one of the program's counselors. Rebecca's brother David entered the community center, his posture stiff and his eyes wary as they scanned the crowded room. Rebecca hurried to greet him, guiding him toward James. "David, this is Pastor James Wilson," she said. "The one I told you about." David nodded, extending his hand. "My sister hasn't stopped talking about you and this program since she got back from Chicago," he said. His handshake was firm, but his eyes remained guarded. "She says you help vets who've tried everything else." "We try," James said simply. "Sometimes people just need someone to listen without judgment." David seemed to relax slightly at these words. That's in short supply these days. Well, we have plenty of it here, James assured him, along with job training, housing assistance, and a community of people who understand what you're going through. As the morning progressed, more than 40 veterans came through the doors, each greeted personally by James and the volunteers. Rebecca stayed by her brother's side as he cautiously began talking with other veterans, his tense shoulders gradually lowering as he found himself among people who understood his experiences. During a quiet moment, Rebecca found James arranging chairs for the afternoon session. "I never thought I'd say this," she said, picking up a chair to help, "but I'm grateful for that day on the plane. If I hadn't made such a terrible mistake, none of this would have happened." James touched the small gold cross at his neck, the same one that had started it all. "Life rarely gives us what we expect," he said, "but it often gives us what we need." Rebecca smiled, "Including people brave enough to stand their ground with grace." "And people humble enough to learn and grow from their mistakes," James added. Together, they turned to welcome another veteran walking through the door, a man whose life was about to change because a flight attendant had told a pastor to remove his cross, and later regretted it.